Hi everyone, and welcome to this Saturday morning's online lesson for the Jazz Academy with Omaha Performing Arts. We're really happy that all of you have joined us today and are interested in connecting with us even through this interlude time where we can't meet with you face to face. This is a great way for us to stay connected and for you to continue to learn some stuff about playing jazz. My name is Shawn Bell. I'm the teaching artist for the Jazz Academy, and we're really happy you joined us this morning. If you want to find out some information about the other programs that OPA offers for all the variety of performing arts that are out there, you can check out the website o-pa.org/online. I'll throw that website up on the screen so you can check it out. It has a lot of great resources for students of all ages and across many of the different artistic disciplines. Now, if you're interested in maybe supporting Omaha Performing Arts during this time, they're doing a lot of great work for educators and for students during this time. Please consider maybe checking out their website to donate. You can just go to their main website, that is opa.org, and you can find some information there about how to donate. All right, great. So today we're going to talk about music theory. I feel like that should be accompanied by maybe a dun 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 type of sound effect, because this is a topic that many people are a little bit reticent to work on, a little nervous about. It seems very complex. So we're hopefully going to break it down a little bit today and talk about the music theory you really need to learn to help you improve as a jazz musician. Now the question might be, well, Shawn, why do we learn music theory? You know, I already hear some ideas in my head that I want to play, and I'm just going to figure them out on my horn. That is a great place to start. And at the end of the day, what we really do want to do is hear melodies and they come out of our instrument. Now, where does music theory come into that? What music theory does is it helps us connect the ideas that are already in our head and helps us understand them so we might know how to apply them on different songs, maybe apply them in different contexts. The other thing that music theory will help us do, it'll help us broaden what those ideas that we can hear. You know, right now, for all of us, we all have certain ideas that we can hear and understand clearly in our mind, and learning a little more about music theory can help expand those ideas. So that's really what we're trying to do when we learn music theory. It is not an end in itself. Ultimately, our real job is to play and to play music. And the listener, they don't care whether we're playing a B-flat major triad or we're playing a sharp 9 chord. They just want it to sound good. However, for us, music theory can really help us get there in a lot of ways. For today, the big emphasis for us is going to be learning about chords. This is where I really like to start with students. There's a lot of things we could talk about when we're talking about music theory, and especially as it applies to jazz improvisation. The biggest thing that most students need to work on is improving their ability to navigate chords, to spell the different types of chords, meaning to know what notes are in them. So let's talk about some of that information. Now, if this is new to you, this might be a lot of new information. If you feel like you already have some of this together, a little bit of this might be repetition, but we're going to cover a pretty broad spectrum of the types of things that chords do, how they function in songs. So hopefully it'll be a little bit of something for everybody. We're going to start with the most basic building block of chords, and that is triads. We have to start here in order to understand the rest of the harmonic material we're going to discuss today. So I'm going to grab my horn here, and let's talk about our 3 main types of triads. There's a couple other types, but we're only going to worry about 3 of them today. We're going to worry about major triads, minor triads, and diminished triads. These are the only kind that we really have to know to get started with jazz theory. And there's a few other types of chords that we might not talk about today, even though they do exist. So let's check it out. When we talk about triads, we're talking about a chord that has 3 notes, hence triad. And this is our basic building block. When we talk about a major triad, that's going to be kind of connected to our major scale. We talk about a minor triad that might be connected to our minor scale. So let's look what these look like and figure out what's going on. So we're going to start in the key of B-flat concert. So I'll put your different transpositions up on the screen. Let's look at our B-flat major triad. It is made up of the root, or the first note of the scale, the third, which is the third note of the scale, and the fifth, which is the fifth note of the scale. It sounds like this. Very, very common triad. So that's our very first place we want to start. That is the primary building block of all of our kind of chord theories, this major triad. So second, we have a minor triad. The only thing that we're going to do is we're going to lower the third. So we're still going to have a root, a third, and a fifth. It's just that the third is going to be lowered a half step. We might also call that a flat third. So in this case, for me as a concert pitched instrument, it's going to go to a D flat. Then if we go to our last type of triad that we're going to talk about today, this is called a diminished triad. And now we're going to lower both the third and the fifth. Cool, so by far the most common ones that we need to worry about are major triads and minor triads. So that's the place to start with. And if you haven't worked on those at all, you're going to want to start there and maybe employ some of the practice strategies that we're going to talk about a little bit later in this lesson. So once we're feeling pretty comfortable with triads, we really want to go to seventh chords. Seventh chords are the most common types of chords when we're playing jazz, and most songs are going to be made up primarily of seventh chords. So let's check this out. We're going to have 4 types that we're going to talk about today. Major 7, minor 7, they're going to connect with our 2 triads. We also have what's called a dominant 7th chord, and then we're going to talk about what's called a half diminished chord. So let's check these out, and then we'll talk about kind of how they work a little later in the lesson. So we'll start with our major 7. We have a major triad on the bottom, a root, third, a fifth, and then we have the same 7th as the major scale, so we would call that a major 7. So it's going to be a B flat, D, F, and A natural if you're in concert pitch. Your other transpositions will be on the screen. That sounds like this. And then we could go through these different triads in the same way we did, or excuse me, the different 7th chords in the same way we did with our triads. So we have a dominant 7th chord is listed next. Now that has a major triad on the bottom, a root, a third, and a fifth, and then it has a lowered 7th, or a flat 7. This is something you'll probably all be familiar with. This is our chord that most of the chords in a blues are. So again, that's a major triad on the bottom, flat 7. Our next one listed is a minor 7th. So now we have a minor triad on the bottom and a flat 7. So we have a B flat, a D flat, an F, and an A flat. And our last one we have is called a half diminished chord. Now we have this diminished triad that we talked about a moment ago on the bottom, and then we have a flat 7. We could also have what's called a fully diminished 7th chord. We're not going to worry about that today. That is a little bit extra step of harmony that is just going to be on the scope of what we're going to talk about today. So let's check out this half diminished 7th chord. All right, so those are our primary building blocks that we need to worry about for jazz. We've got the triads. That's kind of the foundation. We don't really see them that often in jazz. We mostly see 7th chords, but those 4 7th chords we've got to get together in as many keys as we possibly can. Cool. One of the concepts we need to think about in order to practice these chords is what we call inversions. Now, we're not going to go into a deep dive about what inversions are today and when we would use the different ones, but we do need to understand the concept and understand how we practice these. So an inversion is when we change the order of the notes in the chord. So say we take our B flat triad. Again, that's in concert pitch. We have a B flat, a D, and an F. If we invert that, we're going to take our B flat from the bottom, it's going to move to the top, and our D is now going to be the bottom note. So it's going to be a D, F, B flat. It's still a B flat triad. It does not become a D triad because the notes still spell a B flat triad. So it's all about having a B flat, a D, and an F. We could do that same procedure again. We take the D that was in the bottom, we move it to the top, and our F is on the bottom now. We would call that a second inversion because we have flipped it 2 times. This concept is important for us as horn players because it gives us some good practice strategies. You know, if you were a piano player or a guitar player, this is something you're already familiar with. This is going to be something that's very important for you just navigating your instrument. But for you who are horn players out there, this might be a somewhat new concept. So when we actually put this into the context of a practice strategy, let's look at it on a dominant 7th chord. So we're going to look at B flat dominant 7th. This is one of the ways you might want to consider practicing your dominant 7th chords. We're going to play up each inversion. So I'm going to start in what we call root position. That's with my root on the bottom. Now I'm going to invert the chord once, and my third is going to be on the bottom, the D concert. I would invert it again. And then again. And that would be a great practice strategy for each one of these chords you're trying to get together. We could also do it moving down. And depending on which key you're in, sometimes you might have to change octaves. That one goes relatively into the upper register, but for at least trombone players, it's going to fit well in your range. Some instruments you may have to jump octaves. For example, for E flat instruments there, starting at the top on that flat 7, of your G chord is pretty high. So I moved your example down an octave there, and then we jumped back up. So you'll have to be a little bit flexible. So that's one way we can practice these is with inversions. Our second way is we're going to build on our inversions. We're going to add what's called an approach note. An approach note is simply a note that is not in the chord that is approaching a chord tone. So let's look at the example. You'll notice in the first measure, we spell our B flat dominant seventh chord again, but we approach that measure a half step below the starting note. So instead of landing on a B flat concert, or excuse me, starting on a B flat concert, we start on an A natural as a pickup note, and then we land on the B flat concert. Now I put a little arrow above all those approach notes. To take this exercise kind of all the way through, we're going to approach each chord tone. So we have an approach note on the root, then an approach note on the third, then an approach note on the fifth, and an approach note on the flat seven. So let's check out how this sounds. I'm going to play it in tempo. Now we can hear that's really starting to sound like an idea we might use as an improviser. That makes a good little jazz phrase right there. So we hopefully want to connect with some ideas that are actually applicable to how we might play this when we're actually improvising. Cool. So those are a couple of practice strategies to help you work through some of just the nuts and bolts of playing these arpeggios and playing these chords. The next step we've got to talk about when we're talking about music theory is understanding the function of the chords. And so when we talk about function, there are a couple things we need to worry about. Number one, we need to talk about diatonic chords, and number two, we need to talk about Roman numerals. So let's start with diatonic chords. The word diatonic simply means that something is all in one key. So when we play a melody that has no accidentals, it is all in one key, it would be a diatonic melody. So when we create chords that are based on one key, we are creating diatonic chords. And so let's look at how this kind of shakes out with a B-flat concert scale. So we've got a B-flat concert scale up here on the screen, and we can see all of our notes. Now, if we stack up chords above each one of those notes and only use the notes that are in the B-flat major scale, we are going to get a predictable pattern of chords that are going to come out as far as whether they're major or minor or dominant or so on and so forth. So here are all of our chords stacked up. I went out ahead and wrote out the chord nomenclature as well above them. So you can see I have some major chords, I have some minor chords, I have a dominant chord, and for every single key, they're going to be in the same pattern. The first chord of the scale are always major, at least if we're playing diatonically. The second chord of the scale, or the chord based off of the second note of the scale, always going to be minor. The fifth chord of the scale, always going to be a dominant seventh chord. So that is what we mean when we say diatonic harmony. Now, what do we talk about when we're talking about Roman numerals? Let's check that out. Okay, I've gone ahead and applied some Roman numerals to our example here. You can see I have a 1 chord under the first chord, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth. So that's all we're doing. When we talk about Roman numerals, we're thinking about what key am I in and how do I apply the necessary Roman numeral to whatever step of the scale I'm on. So in the key of B flat, a C chord would be a 2 chord, and it would be minor. Now, if I was in a different key, I would label that as a different Roman numeral because it all depends on how we are relating it to the key that we are in at the moment. Cool, let's check this out in context of a song. So we're going to use a blues because that's going to be a good starting place for all of us. We've got a B-flat blues here, and let's go ahead and label through some of the Roman numerals. So here it is without any Roman numerals. Let's kind of go chunk by chunk. So our first phrase, we have a B-flat, an E-flat, and back to a B-flat. So B-flat, we are in the key of B-flat. It's going to be a 1 chord. Now if we move to the next chord, if we think what step is E-flat in the scale, B, C, D, E-flat, it's going to be a 4 chord because it is the 4th step, and then we go back to B-flat. Cool, let's look at the next phrase. Now in this phrase, I started on an E-flat chord, so I'm starting on 4. The next chord is an E natural chord, and it has diminished sign next to it. So let's figure out what we need to do with that. Well, that chord is not diatonic, right? We are not in the key of B flat if we're playing an E natural. So what we want to think about is how can we relate that back to B flat? So E flat is a 4 chord, right? We know that, that's in the key. So E is simply a half step up from E flat. So we're going to call that a sharp 4. So we would call this a sharp 4 diminished chord. Cool, if we keep going on, we go back to B flat. We call that a 1 chord. Then we have a G chord. Now we know G is the 6th step of B flat. If we think back to our diatonic chords, that was a minor chord normally. However, here we see it's a dominant 7th chord. So we've got to be careful and still call it a 6. We are going to make it an uppercase 6 because it is major. However, we're not going to necessarily worry about its function quite yet. We're going to come back to that later in the lesson, how that is going to function. So if we keep going to the next phrase, we see one of our very common progressions in jazz, and hopefully familiar to you, a 2-5-1. We have C, which is the 2 chord, F, which is the 5 chord, and B flat, which is the 1. And then we have 6 again, and then 2-5. So this is our blues broken down with these Roman numerals. Now, we want to be able to do this with any song. So let's look at this in a little bit more, not necessarily complex, but a song that is not a blues and maybe might not be totally familiar to you. So let's check it out. All right, the next example that's in front of us here is the song Autumn Leaves, one of very common standard for us as jazz musicians. Let's look at some of this chord nomenclature and try to analyze this. So first of all, this song is mostly in the key of B flat, or we're going to start thinking about it being in B flat. So let's look at how we would encounter our Roman numerals as we look through this. So we start with C minor 7 to F7 to B flat. Now we just saw in our blues that was our 2-5-1. So that's one of our very common chord progressions, right? So then after that we have another E flat chord. It is a 4 chord. Now that is a different quality, both that B flat chord and that E flat chord. They're both major 7 instead of dominant 7th like they were in the blues. That's okay. We're still going to consider them as a 1 chord for B flat and a 4 chord for E flat. Let's look at the next 4 measures. Now we have an A minor 7 flat 5 to D7 to G minor to G7 flat 9. If we keep thinking in the key of B flat, that's going to be a 7 chord to a 3 chord to a 6 chord and then to like a major 6 chord or a dominant 6 chord. Now that is a little bit less conventional type of chord progression than we might normally see. And so we might need to be a little bit flexible about how we think of some of the sections of this song. Let's check out what would happen if maybe we think about modulating there rather than staying in B flat the entire time. Okay, cool. So when we get to our second phrase, our first phrase is firmly in the key of B flat. However, when we get to the second phrase, we're actually going to switch our mind and we're going to think in terms of G minor. Now, B flat and G minor, they are relative to each other, meaning that they share the same key signature even if they have a different starting note. So if you play in the key of B flat major but you start in a G, you will play G natural minor. So those are called relative keys. And so very common for songs to go from a major key to its relative key. Now, if we look at our chords there and we think in the relative key, so if we think in G minor instead, they might start to make a little more sense. We can see we have an A chord, that's 2 in G, and we have a D chord, that's 5 in G. So again, we have a 2-5. And almost all kind of what we'd call functional progressions, kind of typical progressions, are 2-5-1s here in jazz. We always want to be looking for those 2-5-1s. That's really going to help us to navigate these chords successfully and hopefully also lean on some of our vocabulary that we worked on 2-5-1s. That's really important. Okay, cool. We have one more chord here that we haven't talked about yet. We see a G7 chord at the end of this phrase. So we went from G minor to G7 and then we're repeating back up to C at the beginning of this section of the tune. So this chord is what we call a secondary dominant. Now what does that mean? That means that it doesn't connect to either the key G minor or directly to the key of B flat, but it connects to one of our other chords. It is the dominant of one of our other chords. So when we talk about a dominant chord, that is the 5 of something. And so G is the 5 of C. And we know that our C minor chord started our phrase. So G helps us kind of pivot from G minor. We go through that G dominant 7th, repeat back to the beginning on that C minor chord. So we would say that that G7 chord is 5 of G. We call it secondary dominant because it relates to the key of B flat via the key of C minor or the chord of C minor. Okay, cool. Let's look at a few practice strategies through this tune. All right, we're only going to worry about the first 4 measures. And we're going to work through some of the same ones that we did when we were playing our blues. First, we've got arpeggios, right? So let's arpeggiate through the first 4 measures of the form in quarter notes. Cool, so that was all root position. Now, what if we do our inversions? Let's start on the 3rd of each chord. Cool. Now what if we add our approach notes and maybe move these lines to eighth notes instead of quarter notes. Cool, so I am approaching each root there. You could do this off of each of the chord tones just like we did when we were practicing through those arpeggio exercises or those approach note exercises, but here I just did the roots because my chords are moving to a new chord each measure. All right, once we've kind of worked through some of that stuff, what we're going to want to do is kind of throw this all into the blender and try to apply it on actually the song. I'm going to pull up a play along and kind of show you how some of this stuff might work. I'm going to play through 2 repetitions of the first 8 bars of the form. And so I'll project that up here on the screen again so you can see the chords. I'm going to start by playing just the root and the third of each chord. I'm not even going to play the full arpeggio. And as I kind of progress through these 2 sections, I'm going to gradually incorporate more notes from the arpeggio, but I'm only going to play arpeggios. This can really be a great way to practice only thinking arpeggios and go from being very structured and or very limited in how many notes you choose to gradually adding more notes as you feel more confident. So let's check out what that would sound like if I only play arpeggios. Now I'm going to choose whatever rhythm I want, but I'm only going to play a limited amount of notes from the chord and then add them. Okay, cool. So hopefully that showed you how we can kind of apply some of this stuff to start actually using these arpeggios on songs and using this chord information. The reason this chord information is so important is this is what the piano player plays or the guitar player plays. They don't necessarily play scales. They are playing somewhere between 3, sometimes only 2 notes, possibly up to 4 or 5 notes of the chord, and mostly playing these notes that are just in these primary arpeggios. And so we want to really connect with that as horn players or as soloists to make sure that we are fitting inside the chord and know what notes will sound like good resolution notes. Now today, nowhere did we talk about scales at all. They are important, but not the primary thing that we want to focus on as kind of beginning to intermediate and even advancing students. Really need to focus on learning these arpeggios, getting that information really, really strong. Okay, cool. That's all I've got for you today. So we will see you next week for another installment of these online lessons with Omaha Performing Arts. We'll see you then.